First off, a bit of background on cigarettes. Cigarettes are highly addictive and therefore have an inelastic demand, so a change in the price will have a minimal effect on the quantity demanded. We will go into more detail for this in later questions. Question 1 is asking whether cigarettes are a necessity, luxury, or an inferior good. In our case, Joanne is quoted as saying the price rise will not stop her from smoking. Now, we can evaluate this question through the definition of three possible answers and the subsequent deduction. An inferior good is one that as income increases, demand for this good decreases. An example of this is McDonald's. As your income increases, you'll be more likely to go out and eat at a fancy restaurant. Now, a luxury is one that is defined as something that a large proportion of income is spent to purchase. An example of this is a Ferrari or a yacht. A necessity is something that someone cannot live without, such as food or water. However, necessities differ between individuals. For example, the necessity of a guitarist is obviously a guitar. Now, to some individuals such as myself, I classify guitar as a luxury good. However, by the definition of a necessity, it is not characterized by the inherent properties of a good, but on the preference of the buyer. Now, if we look at the answers, we can use the information previously provided and by the process of deduction get the answer. So, cigarettes cannot be defined as an inferior good, as a higher income would likely lead to an increase in the purchase of cigarettes. Therefore, they could be defined as a normal good. However, this is not available in any of the answers. Therefore, we must consider if they are a luxury good. Now, although a majority of smokers do spend a considerable amount of their income on cigarettes, in the case of Joanne, it would be more correct to label cigarettes as a necessity. This is due to her indicating that the price rise will not stop her from smoking. She has built up an addiction and therefore will continue to consume cigarettes and cut expenditure on travel. This supports the claim that cigarettes demand is inelastic and the change in price will have little effect on the quantity demanded. We therefore can deduce that the answer to question 1 is A. Cigarettes are a necessity.
So question 2 is asking us, if the majority of smokers represent Yalkin's view, I would keep on smoking but not that much anymore, what will the actual market for cigarettes actually look like when the tobacco excise is being imposed? Well, to answer this, we are given 4 different graphs and thus 4 different possible markets. Graph A or market A is indicating the entire tax burden, represented by this green area, is being passed on to the buyer. The price the buyers pay is equal to what the sellers receive plus the price of tax, represented by these 2 dashed lines. In this case, graph A is suggesting that demand for cigarettes is perfectly inelastic. This means that any sort of change in the price, either an increase or a decrease, the same quantity of cigarettes will be demanded. While we know the demand for cigarettes is inelastic, realistically, this market cannot possibly represent the majority of smokers. If cigarettes, for instance, were priced at $1 million, it is not feasible that the same quantity of cigarettes will be demanded by the market in a real-life scenario. Samantha is quoted as saying, "That would mean just straight up quit. I can't afford the $40. It's not worth the habit. It's already expensive as it is." Thus, by deduction, we can confidently conclude that graph A is incorrect. Graph C, on the other hand, is indicating that demand for cigarettes is more elastic than the supply of cigarettes. As such, we see a prominent change in the tax burden in comparison to graph A. Majority of the tax burden is being passed on to the seller, represented by this red area. However, a minor portion of the tax is still burdened on the buyer, represented by this green area, because the quantity demanded is elastic, not perfectly elastic. The graph is suggesting that the quantity demanded is very sensitive to changes in price. However, we already know that demand for cigarettes is inelastic, meaning quantity demanded doesn't change much in response to higher prices. Clearly, graph C is actually the opposite of the market we are looking for. Thus, by deduction, we can also confidently remove graph C from our possible pool of answers. Now we are left with both graphs B and D. Graph B is indicating an equal share of the tax burden between the buyers and the sellers. This is also represented by the green and red area. What this essentially means is that the elasticity of quantity demanded is equal to that of quantity supplied. Although graph B is a more likely scenario than A and C, it still fails to fit our criteria, where the demand for cigarettes is less elastic than the supply, or inelastic. In fact, graph C represents a very unique scenario. Rarely does the tax on a good share an equal tax burden between buyers and sellers. Thus, it's unlikely to apply to any sort of goods, and it's unlikely to apply to cigarettes. So we can conclude that B is likely incorrect. We are now left with graph D, which is the market most likely to represent the majority of smokers like Yalkin. Now let me explain why. Graph D fits our criteria where the demand for cigarettes is inelastic, insensitive to changes in price, either an increase or a decrease. Supply is also elastic, meaning the majority of the tax burden is being passed on to the buyer, represented by the green area. The graph differs from graph A as the seller still holds a minor portion of the burden, represented by the red area, as demand is inelastic, not perfectly inelastic. Graph D provides the most likely scenario for smokers like Yalkin, who would keep on smoking but not that much anymore, suggesting they have an inelastic demand. Thus, we can conclude from the subsequent deductions of all the answers, D is the most correct. Additionally, a general rule to remember is the less elastic side of the market will always carry a larger share of the tax burden. Now, question 3 is asking us to comment on the following statement. Holding all the factors constant, if smokers were more sensitive to the increase in the tobacco excise, the deadweight loss would be smaller. Once again, we are given 3 different possible answers. A. True. B. False. C. Depends. But instead of tackling the question straight on, we must first define deadweight loss and further explain its application. Deadweight loss is an economic concept that interprets the loss to society, the buyers and the sellers, as a result of inefficiencies in the market. In other words, deadweight loss is the loss of economic efficiency or allocative efficiency when a good or service cannot reach equilibrium. Furthermore, there are various causes of deadweight loss. These include price ceilings and price floors, such as rent control and the minimum wage, externalities and subsidies, such as national defense and government subsidies to Australian farmers, and also taxes, such as an income tax and in our case a tobacco excise. But what does deadweight loss actually look like graphically? Well, if we take graph B from the previous question, deadweight loss is represented in this triangle located here, in between the burden of tax and the supply and demand curve. This triangle is otherwise known as the Harburger's triangle. The larger the Harburger's triangle is, the larger the deadweight loss is, and thus a larger loss to society and lower standard of living. If the tax on tobacco increases, the larger the deadweight loss would be, as this would lead to a reduction in the quantity. However, the size of tax isn't the only factor that determines the size of deadweight loss. We have already seen how elasticity affects the division of the tax burden. Likewise, elasticity is also a major determinant in calculating the size of deadweight loss. In this particular question, we are asked, if smokers were more sensitive to the increase in the tobacco excise, would the deadweight loss be smaller? In other words, if smokers have an elastic demand in response to changes in price, would the deadweight loss be smaller? The easiest way to answer this is to take graph C and graph D from the previous question. Graph C represents Samantha's view of higher prices. That would mean just quit straight up. I can't afford $40. It's already expensive as it is. So we know she holds an elastic demand. Graph D, on the other hand, represents Yelkin's view of higher prices. I would keep on smoking, but not that much anymore. So he holds an inelastic demand. Now, if we compare the size of the Harburger triangle between graph C and graph D, we see that graph C, where demand is elastic, the deadweight loss has a larger area in comparison to graph D, where demand is inelastic. Meaning, when quantity demanded is elastic, the deadweight loss is not smaller, but actually larger. Thus, the answer is B, false. But why is this? When QD or QS is elastic, the contraction in quantity will be larger, so the deadweight loss is larger. When quantity demanded or quantity supplied is inelastic, the contraction in quantity will be smaller, so the deadweight loss is smaller. So, we can now confidently conclude that the answer to question 3 is in fact B, false.
Question 4 asks us to discuss whether taxpayers' money should be spent on scare campaigns, and is the money allocated effectively even though the private costs of smoking are already accounted for by the individual when they choose to smoke. Smoking, though it may seem to only affect the individual who has already accounted for these private costs of ill health and the forever growing purchasing costs, is a deadly habit that creates far-reaching issues in which the government must address. When individuals choose to smoke, they do not take into account the underlying cost to society. These are the negative externalities, or in layman's terms, the unconsidered negative outcomes of an economic activity. Consequently, we can say that the market has failed and so the government must intervene. Smoking contributes to pollution, can permit others to passively smoke, which involuntarily risks their own health, and most importantly, causes various life-threatening cancers and illnesses. These all cause outrageous spending on treatment and healthcare, and wider cleaner programs of endless cigarette butts in the street and the terrible emissions in our air. It is therefore evident that these scare programs are not wasting taxpayers' money, but rather are attempting to tackle a far greater issue which needs to be managed. The real issue is the fact that smokers do understand they have increased health risks when they begin smoking, and those that have already built up a smoking habit are unlikely to be deterred from smoking by scare campaigns alone. A more effective way to allocate taxpayers' money would be to establish support services such as rehabilitation, support groups, or subsidizing nicotine. These would help to break the addiction and support scare campaigns in completing the government's goal. In theory, increasing the excise tax on cigarettes will decrease the demand for cigarettes to an extent. This statement can be said to be a positive statement, as it is backed by statistics. As quoted in the case study, the number of smokers in Australia has dwindled over recent decades, from about a quarter in the early 1990s to closer to 13% now, partly due to the previous tobacco excise increases. This circumstance is evident by looking at the demand curve. A tax will see an increase in price, which indicates a movement along the curve itself. This results in a lower demand for cigarettes. However, as cigarettes are an inelastic good, this will have only a small effect on the decrease in the demand. In turn, the government will spend less on healthcare in relation to smoking health issues such as lung cancer. Something else to consider is that with the tax hike, a smoker is basically subsidizing their future healthcare costs. As the government raises revenue to cover the cost of healthcare, a smoker would be partially contributing to the extra costs that are involved with smoking. Scare campaigns are likely to be much more effective targeting young people that have not started yet to smoke. This will see a shift in the demand curve to the left, indicating a decrease in demand, as less people will demand the good as they are afraid to accept the health risks involved that are often alluded to in these campaigns. Therefore, scare campaigns are effective in targeting the problem early in the hope to deter the number of future smokers and hopefully reduce the future cost of smoking to the economy. As a whole, us as economists can have our own personal opinions. Now, these are known as normative statements. My opinion on this question will be different to the opinion of other economists. I believe the scare campaigns are not a waste of taxpayers' money, as the private costs of smoking are not the only burden to society that accompanies cigarettes. However, like previously mentioned, the government must implement other strategies to attempt to lower the amount of cigarettes being consumed in order to tackle the greater issue that they have on the economy.